Here's the slide we're going to work with today. Before we dive into the meat of the slide, I like to take a minute and make sure I understand the title. Immediately we can tell that this is a slide about labor regulations. We can also infer that they are increasing. But the main crux of the title is actually that employers are going to be held accountable for penalties due to these new labor regulations. I think this slide title is only okay. It does set up the infographic, but it's a little wordy and parts of it are redundant. I think we should rework the title after we take a look at the graphic. The first and most obvious thing I notice when looking at the body of the slide is that there's two graphics trying to supplement the information provided to us in the headline. And so I find my eyes going back and forth, trying to make sense of the story. For instance, when I read the figures on the left, I can see that 3 states already have dedicated labor laws. But this notion is supplemented by the visual graphic on the right. Similarly, the figure on the left tells us that there are 20 states with pending legislation. But that data point also feels disjointed, as once again it's illustrated by the opposing graphic on the opposite side. Also, the figures on the left show the state numbers and population numbers emphasized. But the takeaway from the slide is expressed in percentages. That brings us to the graphic on the left, which I believe was included to help illustrate those percentages. First, we have 15 dark blue people, ostensibly meant to represent the 15% of Americans who are already covered by enacted labor laws. Next, we see 45 medium blue people, representing the 45% of Americans who may soon be potentially covered under pending legislation. And of course, lastly, we see the 40% of Americans who are currently not covered under any sort of labor legislation at all. So again, our audience is having to do a lot of work, reckoning 3 different units of information, numbers of states, percentages of Americans, and population of Americans, across 2 different infographics. I think we can elevate this slide to make it much easier to understand at a glance. I propose the following 3 steps. 1. Choose one infographic to tell the story. 2. Strip away any non-essential visual elements. And lastly, 3. Eliminate redundant data points. In terms of understanding the slide at a glance, I think we'll get more mileage out of the United States graphic once it's paired with some large percentages. I've deleted the percentage graphic along with its corresponding title. Focusing on the US graphic on the right, I think there's several elements that we can remove or minimize to help the audience focus on where they're supposed to look. In this instance, I don't think we need the state labels. It may seem like a small thing, but every little bit can count. I'm also not convinced that the states without any legislation need a dedicated blue color. I'm going to try it in light gray and see how it looks. Even without the benefit of the legend, I think it's now clear which states have some form of legislation and which ones don't. I'm also going to take a second to reposition my map where I want it to go. Next, I'm removing any data from the left that talks about numbers of states. I think this is immediately apparent now when you look at the graphic on the right. I also did away with the legend completely. My plan is to pump up the information on the left and color code it so that it's immediately obvious that it corresponds with the graphic on the right. The 15%, representing the 15% of Americans already covered by legislation, will be color-coded dark blue, while the 45%, representing the 45% of Americans that may soon be covered by pending legislation, will be color-coded in medium blue. And here's where we landed with the body of our slide. We have a slide that's much easier to understand at a glance. We've chosen one infographic to help tell the story, we've stripped away any non-essential visual elements, and we've eliminated the redundant data points, making sure to pump up the corresponding data points to the graphic. But before we go and sign off on this slide, as mentioned, I wanted to return to the title. New labor regulations, either enacted or under consideration. This part here seems parenthetical. Even though it's essential to the message of the slide, it's basically what we detail in the body of the slide, so I'm going to delete that. I'm also going to delete the phrase "with new benefits," as I find it superfluous to the overall messaging of the slide title. And lastly, I want to add the word "resulting" before penalties, as a nod to our intended audience, employers. What we're left with is a title that's clear and succinct. New labor regulations will potentially impact 60% of American workers and hold employers accountable with resulting penalties.